This story you're about to hear, it's not just a tale, it's what happened to me, John Miller. And believe me when I tell you, it changed everything. I thought I knew about family, about love, and about what a man is willing to do when pushed to the absolute brink. The day my own flesh and blood stripped me bare, leaving me for dead. At 65 was the day I stopped being a father and started becoming their judge. They thought they'd extinguish the flame, but all they did was stoke an inferno. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My name is John Miller, though most folks around Fort Worth, Texas knew me as Big John. Not because I was particularly tall, but because I built Miller Construction from nothing into a regional powerhouse over 4 decades. From the concrete foundations of humble homes in Weatherford to the steel skeletons of high-rises gleaming in the Dallas skyline. My fingerprints were on a good chunk of North Texas. I was a self-made man, a firm believer in honest work, a handshake deal, and the sanctity of family. My wife, Helen, bless her soul, had been gone for 5 years. By then, her absence left a gaping hole in my life, a silence that no amount of construction noise could fill. But I had my children, Michael and Sarah. They were my world, my legacy, the very reason I'd poured every ounce of blood, sweat, and tears into that company. Michael, my son, was 42, sharp as a tack. He'd inherited my business. Acumen, but with a modern, almost aggressive edge that sometimes made me uneasy. He'd been running the operational side of Miller Construction for over a decade, taking it to new heights. He always reminded me, Sarah. My daughter was 37. Beautiful, charming. She had a way of wrapping people around her finger. She handled the marketing and administrative side, all smiles and charisma. The perfect public face for the company. I loved them fiercely, blindly as only a father can. At 65, I felt the years catching up. My doctor had given me a mild warning about my heart. Nothing dire, just a suggestion to slow down. Helen's passing had also taken a toll. I decided it was time to fully step back to trade the clang of steel for the quiet hum of a fishing boat on Lake Benbrook, to spend my golden years doing just that, being golden. So I gathered Michael and Sarah in my study, the very room where I'd drawn up my first blueprints, where Helen and I had celebrated countless milestones. The air was thick with expectation, and a warmth spread through my chest as I looked at my children, ready to hand them the keys to everything I'd ever built, kids. I began, my voice a little hoarse with emotion. Your mother and I, we built this for you, and now it's yours. The plan was simple, or so. I thought I signed over Miller Construction and all its associated assets, including my beautiful ranch-style home in Aledo, just west of Fort Worth, and the few investment properties I'd acquired over the years into a trust. Michael and Sarah would be co-trustees and beneficiaries. In return, I would retain a substantial monthly allowance for life full health insurance coverage, and of course full access to my home. It was a gift, a testament to my trust and love designed to secure their future, and by extension my own comfortable retirement. They hugged me, their words a chorus of gratitude. Well, take care of you, Dad. Michael had set his grip firm on my shoulder. Sarah, tears welling in her eyes, promised you'll never have to worry about a thing. We celebrated that night, a grand dinner at a fancy steakhouse downtown. I felt a profound sense of peace, believing I had done right by my family. Ensuring their prosperity for generations, I was stepping into the sunset, hand in hand with the legacy I'd built. That first few months were idyllic. I woke up without an alarm, spent mornings sipping coffee on my porch overlooking the rolling Texas hills and afternoons with a fishing rod in my hand. My allowance arrived promptly. My health insurance card felt like a golden ticket. I felt light free. Then the cracks began to appear. My allowance, usually deposited on the first of the month, was late. A week passed. I called Michael Markets. Tough right now. Dad, he said, his tone a little sharper than usual. Cash flow issues. It'll be there next week. But it was a couple of $100 short, just a temporary adjustment. Sarah chirped over the phone while optimizing the trust performance. Dad, I brushed it off. Business had its ups and downs. Next, my health insurance. A letter arrived in the mail, notifying me of a change in my plan. The premium had dropped significantly, which sounded good, but a quick call to the provider revealed a massive downgrade in coverage. My preferred specialists were out of network. My prescriptions required higher co-pays. When I confronted Michael, he sounded exasperated. Dad were just optimizing. Do you know how much a top-tier plan costs these days? We're trying to make sure the trust lasts. Sarah added, it's for the best. Dad, you're getting older. You don't need all those fancy bells and whistles. The words stung. Then came the car, my new Ford F-150. A truck I'd bought just 2 years prior. Michael started borrowing it for company business. First for a day, then a weekend, then an entire week. One morning I went to the garage and it was simply gone. When I called, Michael informed me we decided to sell it. Dad depreciating asset. The trust needed the liquidity. Well, get you a smaller, more practical sedan when funds allow. The sedan never materialized. I was stranded, relying on rides from my dwindling circle of friends, or a taxi I had to pay for out of pocket. My access to my own money became a labyrinth. My bank accounts linked to the trust suddenly required their authorization for any significant withdrawal. My credit cards were cancelled. New ones issued in the trust, name accessible only by Michael and Sarah. I, the man who had built an empire, had to ask my children for pocket money. It felt like being a child again, but without the innocence. The isolation was the insidious killer. My old friends, my fishing buddies, my former colleagues, they stopped calling. When I tried to reach them, sometimes their numbers were disconnected, or they sounded strangely distant. It turned out Sarah had taken over managing my phone calls and calendar screening everything. Protecting your peace. Dad, she had sweetly explained, you need to relax, not be bothered by old business associates. I was slowly, meticulously being cut off from the world I knew. The hammer drop came on a Tuesday. I remember the date because it was Helen's birthday. They sat me down in my own living room, the one with the fireplace where Helen and I used to spend winter evenings. Michael's face was stern, Sarah's uncharacteristically devoid of her usual charm. Dad Michael began the trust. It's not performing as expected with the current market. We need to make some difficult decisions. Decisions about what I asked are not forming in my stomach. I knew even before they said it. Sarah spoke, her voice flat. The house, Dad. It's a significant asset. Too much upkeep, too much tied up in it. We need to sell it to optimize the trust's value. My house, my home. The place where Helen and I had raised our children, where we celebrated holidays, where I had envisioned spending my final years. Sell it, but where will I go? Michael's response was chillingly rehearsed. We've found a lovely assisted living facility. For you, Dad, it's in Grand Prairie, very clean. Good staff. It's for the best. You're getting older. You need more supervision, more care. Supervision, care. Perfectly capable, I roared, standing up, my voice shaking. This is my home. You can't do this. Sarah's eyes were cold. Dad, we can do this. The trust documents which you signed give us full authority to manage assets as we see fit. We're doing what's best for everyone. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The legal paperwork I had signed, trusting my children implicitly, had become the weapon they used against me. The day I was forced out felt like a dream, a horrifying, surreal nightmare. My cherished belongings, Helen's old rocking chair, my framed photos, my collection of vintage tools were all gone, sold off, or stored indefinitely. Only a few boxes of clothes and personal effects were packed into a dusty, anonymous van. I watched helpless as my children. The people I had given everything to instructed the movers to load my meager possessions. Michael avoided my gaze while Sarah, standing by the front door, kept glancing at her watch, clearly impatient. The lovely assisted living facility in Grand Prairie was anything but. It was a grim utilitarian building with a pervasive smell of disinfectant and despair. The rooms were small, identical, and sparsely furnished. The staff, though polite, were clearly overworked and underpaid. My allowance had dwindled to nothing. My medication for my heart, for my blood pressure, became inconsistent. I was just another number in a long-forgotten hallway. Days blurred into weeks. I tried to call friends old, business associates, even lawyers. My calls were now openly monitored by the facility staff under instruction from Michael and Sarah, who claimed I was prone to confusion and needed oversight. Each attempt was met with a polite refusal to connect me or a promise to pass on the message that never reached its destination. I was a prisoner in my own fading life, locked away, forgotten. One particularly rough night, I was hit with a terrible stomach bug. I pressed the call button over and over, but no one came. I lay there weak, nauseous, utterly alone. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting long, sterile shadows. I felt completely helpless, abandoned. They hadn't just taken my money. They'd stripped me of my dignity, my autonomy, my very identity. They had left me for dead. My gaze drifted to the window, where the distant and different lights of the Fort Worth skyline shimmered. A city I had helped build now seemed to mock me. A wave of profound despair washed over me, threatening to drown what little spirit I had left, but then a flicker. A memory, Helen's voice, soft but firm, whispering in my ear. John, you're a fighter. Never give up. And in that moment, lying there sick and broken, something shifted deep inside me. The vulnerability, the shame, the heartbreak. It didn't shatter me, it hardened. They had left me for dead, yes, but I wasn't dead. Not yet, and a cold, clear resolve began to form in my mind. A vow, etched in the deepest part of my soul. They had taken everything. Now it was time for me to take it all back. And then some. The fluorescent lights continued their ceaseless hum, a constant sterile reminder of my prison, the stink of disinfectant, the sound of distant coughs, the clatter of a medication cart. It all swirled around me, a symphony of my own personal hell. But something had shifted. Helen's voice, a whisper from the grave, had ignited a spark. John, you're a fighter. Never give up. That spark wasn't warmth, it was ice. It wasn't comfort. It was a blade being sharpened. They thought they'd extinguish the flame, but all they did was stoke an inferno. Lying there, stomach churning, body aching, a new kind of clarity washed over me. Despair was a luxury I could no longer afford. My children, no. Not my children. Michael and Sarah had stripped me bare, left me to rot. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had left me alive. The first step was to survive. The staff here, they weren't evil. just indifferent, overworked. I started observing, then rotating shifts, the times when the nurses were busiest, the routines of the orderlies. I noticed the blind spots in the surveillance, the corners of the dining hall where a conversation might go unnoticed, the occasional unlocked utility closet. I began to hoard. A cracker here, a packet of sugar there, my heart medication. My blood pressure pills, I'd pretend to take them, palming them discreetly, building a small stash. Not to harm myself, but because I knew instinctively that a clear head and a steady hand would be vital. My mind, once dulled by the shock and the drugs, began to sharpen. I'd spend hours in the communal living area, listening to the rambling conversations of other residents, sifting through the local newspapers. They occasionally left behind. I pieced together fragments of the outside world, learning about local politics, property sales, anything that might be a clue. I needed information, and I needed a way out. The biggest hurdle was communication. Every phone call was monitored, every visitor screened. But I remembered an old trick from my early days in construction when I had to get bids out under tight deadlines with unreliable phones. I needed a letter A, physical letter. It took me 3 days to find a pen and paper without drawing suspicion. I borrowed a ballpoint pen from an unattended desk during a momentary distraction, and I carefully tore out a blank page from the back of an old discarded paperback someone had left in the common room. I folded it small, tucking it into the waistband of my sweatpants. The letter itself was simple, direct and carefully worded. It wasn't to Michael or Sarah, it was to Frank Jensen. He'd been my head foreman for 30 years, a man whose loyalty was etched deeper than any contract. Had retired a few years back, bought a small place near Weatherford, raised longhorns. He was a straight shooter, a man who wouldn't be easily swayed by Michael and Sarah's lies. Frank. I wrote my hand, trembling slightly, the words flowing with an urgency I hadn't felt in years. It's John, I need your help. I'm in assisted living in Grand Prairie on Highway 360, near the airport. They've cut me off. Michael and Sarah, they've taken everything. Please, Frank, come see me, don't tell anyone. And don't believe what they tell you. I'm not confused, I'm just trapped. I scrawled my room number at the bottom. Getting the letter out was another challenge. I couldn't just drop it in a mailbox. It had to be hand-delivered discreetly. I waited for days watching planning. Then, during one of the facility's infrequent family days when relatives were allowed to visit, I saw my chance. A young woman, a volunteer, was helping a resident take a walk outside, pushing his wheelchair. She seemed kind, not yet hardened by the system. As she passed me, I pretended to stumble, dropping my newspaper. As she bent to help, I quickly slipped the folded paper into her apron pocket, whispering, "Please, this is important. Mail it, don't tell anyone." Her eyes met mine, a flicker of understanding there, or perhaps just surprise. She nodded almost imperceptibly as she helped me back into my chair, then continued on her way. It was a gamble, but it was all I had. The wait was agonizing. Each day felt like a week. I watched the door, hoping, praying. Then, nearly 2 weeks later, a familiar face appeared in the visitors' lounge. Frank. His hair was grayer, his face more weathered, but the same steel was in his eyes. He sat across from me, his expression a mix of concern and guarded skepticism. "John, they said you were not doing so well. Michael called me, told me you were having memory issues. Said you'd signed everything over for your own good." "Frank," I said, my voice low, raw with emotion. "It's a lie. All of it. They stripped me clean. Took the house, the truck, the company. Left me here to die. I'm not confused. Frank, I'm just angry. and I need your help. I recounted everything from the dwindling allowance to the downgraded insurance, the stolen truck, the forced removal from my home, the isolation, the monitoring. Frank listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes never leaving mine. He knew I wasn't a man to make up stories. He saw the fire in my eyes, the cold clarity that had replaced the despair. Damn them, he finally breathed, a vein throbbing in his temple. Damn them to hell. I heard things, John, but I didn't want to believe it. Michael, he's been making some wild decisions with the company. Fired half the old crew, brought in some new blood, inexperienced youngsters. Started selling off equipment properties. Said it was restructuring. But I heard the main office building in Dallas was up for sale. Your old office, John. The one you built with your own hands. The news hit me harder than any punch. My office, my legacy, the Dallas building. I whispered, my voice thick with rage. They're selling the headquarters. Frank nodded grimly. And I heard rumors about some big land deals. Shady ones. Michael's been seen with some unsavory types. Big money boys from Houston, not the kind of folks you ever dealt with. John, my children weren't just betraying me. They were dismantling everything I'd painstakingly built. They weren't just taking my money. They were desecrating my life's work. The inferno inside me roared. Frank, I said, leaning forward, my voice barely a whisper but laced with an undeniable steel. I need to get out of here, and I need to know everything, every single detail, every deal, every asset, every person they've wronged. I want the names, the dates, the numbers. Frank looked around the room, then back at me. How? They've got you locked down tight. They think I'm weak, confused. I replied, a grim smile touching my lips. Well, use that against them. You come back next week. Tell them you're taking me out for a drive, a special lunch, just to lift my spirits. Say I'm lonely missing the open road. Play their game, Frank. Say whatever you need to say. Get me out of here, and then we start rebuilding. Frank's eyes held a mixture of awe and fear, but beneath it I saw the old loyalty. You got a plan, John. I've got a war, Frank, I said. My gaze fixed on the distant Fort Worth skyline, now no longer mocking but a battleground, and it starts the moment I walk out that door. Over the next few days, Frank made the arrangements. He called the facility, spun a convincing story about my need for an outing, an hour or two of fresh air. He was a distant cousin. He claimed visiting from out of state and wanted to treat Uncle John. Michael and Sarah, absorbed in their new empire, likely saw no harm in a harmless, confused old man having a short, supervised outing. It kept me quiet, out of their hair. The day of the escape arrived. I dressed in the clothes. Frank had brought a simple plaid shirt, denim jeans, a pair of worn boots. Nothing fancy, just practical. I walked to the visitors' lounge with a shuffle, my eyes downcast, playing the part of the frail, submissive resident. My heart pounded, but my expression was carefully neutral. Frank was already there, chatting casually with the front desk nurse. He turned to me, his smile warm and reassuring. Ready for that drive, Uncle John? I nodded slowly. Yes, Frank. A drive sounds nice. The nurse smiled. Just be back by 3, Mr. Jensen. Mr. Miller needs his afternoon medication. Of course, Frank replied smoothly. Signing the log, he put a hand on my back, guiding me towards the exit. Each step felt like a lifetime. The automatic doors slid open, and a wave of fresh, glorious, unfiltered Texas air hit my face. It smelled of exhaust fumes and freedom. We got into Frank's beat-up Ford pickup truck, a familiar sight, and pulled away from the sterile building. I didn't look back. Frank drove his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and I sat, silently, letting the wind whip through the open window, feeling the blood course through my veins alive, truly alive for the first time in months. "Where to, John?" Frank asked, his voice low. "First," I said, my gaze hardening. "We need to disappear. I can't be John Miller anymore. Not yet. I need a place where I can think, where I can plan, where I can become the man they never saw coming." Frank nodded, understanding. He drove for what felt like hours past the familiar highways of Fort Worth, past the glittering towers that bore my fingerprints, past the sprawling suburbs I'd helped build. We were heading west, deeper into the Texas countryside, away from the city, away from Michael and Sarah's reach. We ended up at an old abandoned hunting cabin Frank owned, tucked deep in the woods near the Brazos River, about an hour west of Weatherford. It was rustic, isolated, perfect. No electricity, just a well and a propane stove. It was a place where I could be a ghost. Frank said about making sure I had supplies canned, goods, water, a small radio, a first aid kit, a burner phone, and a stack of cash, enough to get by for a while. He also brought something else, a small faded photo album. Helen and Michael as a boy, Sarah as a little girl, all smiling happy before the poison set in. I stared at the pictures, the memories, a sharp, painful contrast to the reality. "I'll start digging," John Frank said, his voice grim. "Call my old contacts, see what Michael and Sarah have really been up to, get you some real intel." I nodded, my eyes still on the faded photographs. "Tell no one where I am, Frank. No one. For all intents and purposes, John Miller is gone. He vanished. Maybe he wandered off confused. Maybe he died in that facility. I don't care what they think I looked up, meeting Frank's gaze, my resolve ironclad. But what I care about, Frank, is what they did. He left me there in the quiet solitude of the cabin, surrounded by the towering oak trees and the rustle of leaves. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of retirement, but the calm before a storm. I was no longer a victim, was a phantom, a shadow. And shadows, I knew, could move unseen. Striking from the dark, I started to organize my thoughts, listing the offenses, the betrayals, the destruction of my legacy. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about vengeance, for my home, for my dignity, for Helen's memory, for the company I built, and for every loyal soul Michael and Sarah had discarded like trash. My first target wasn't Michael or Sarah directly. It was their source of power, their money, their reputation. I knew the construction business inside and out. I knew where the weak points were, where the secrets were buried. I knew how to build, and more importantly, I knew how to dismantle. I picked up the burner phone Frank had given me. It felt foreign in my hand. No contacts, no history. A blank slate. I thought about the names Frank had mentioned, the unsavory types Michael was dealing with, the shady land deals. My initial focus began to narrow. I needed to identify the most vulnerable link in their chain, the weakest point in their ill-gotten empire. I remembered an old saying from my days as a young foreman, a lesson learned the hard way on a crumbling foundation. To bring down a building, you don't start with the roof, you go for the supports, the very ground it stands on. I looked at the simple map Frank had left tracing the outline of Fort Worth, Dallas, the surrounding counties. My empire now, theirs, but not for long. My gaze settled on a small, unassuming dot on the map, far from the gleaming towers of Dallas. A new development. Michael had recently championed a massive, controversial residential project out in the exurbs of Denton County. The Miller Estates at Whisper Creek, they called it. A massive tract of land acquired cheaply, promising luxury homes. It was the kind of project that could make or break a company. and it was exactly the kind of project that, if compromised, could bring everything crashing down. That was it. That was the foundation I would shatter. First, I picked up the pen and began to write, not a letter of desperation, but a battle plan, a detailed blueprint for retribution. But the game had changed. John Miller was dead, and in his place, a ghost was rising, ready to haunt them until their every dream turned to ash. I would start by exposing the rot at Whisper Creek, and I would watch them burn. The cabin when Frank dropped me off was as desolate as it was perfect. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten dust. No electricity, no running water beyond the hand pump outside, just the whispering silence of the Brazos River woods. It was a stark contrast to the climate-controlled luxury I'd built for myself, to the meticulous order of my Aledo home. But that was the point. I needed to shed the skin of Big John Miller, the successful patriarch, and become something else entirely. A ghost, a predator. The first few days were brutal. My body, accustomed to the soft beds and regular meals of the assisted living facility, protested the hard cot and the meager provisions. My mind, still reeling from the past months of betrayal and confinement, felt like a storm-tossed sea, but I forced myself into a routine. I chopped firewood with an old rusty axe. Frank had left the physical exertion a welcome distraction. I hauled water from the well, the cold sting on my hands a reminder that I was alive. I ate canned beans and crackers, making each meal last, rationing my supplies with the precision of a man preparing for a siege. Slowly, painstakingly, the fog in my mind began to clear. The physical discomfort sharpened my senses. The silence of the woods became a canvas for my thoughts. Not a void, I spread out the maps Frank had given me, tracing the familiar roads of Denton County, the arteries of Fort Worth, the veins leading to Dallas. My empire, their stolen legacy. I started listing everything, scribbling on the back of old lumber receipts Frank had scavenged for me. Every property Michael and Sarah had access to, every known project Miller Construction was undertaking. My gaze kept returning to that small dot on the map. The Miller Estates at Whisper Creek. It was a new venture, a sprawling residential development in the exurbs of Denton County, far enough from the city to offer country living, but close enough for commuters. Michael had pushed it hard, seeing it as his signature project, his mark on the company. That made it a prime target. Frank returned a week later, driving his pickup down the winding dirt track to the cabin. He looked tired, but his eyes held that same loyal fire. He carried a duffel bag, not just with more supplies, but with a trove of information. "It's worse than I thought," Johnny said, setting the bag down on the rickety table. "Miller Construction. It is not the company you built anymore. Michael's been gutting it." He pulled out a stack of documents, financial statements, company, memos, articles from local business journals. He fired nearly all the old guard, John people who'd been with you for decades, replaced them with his college buddies fresh out of business school. No real experience. They're cutting corners everywhere. My blood ran cold as I scanned the financial reports. The numbers didn't lie. Michael was bleeding the company, dry leveraging assets, taking out massive loans against properties I'd built outright. He was gambling everything on high-risk, quick turnaround projects. Whisper Creek being the biggest. Whisper Creek, I said, my voice flat. "What have you heard about it specifically?" Frank pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. "Environmentalists are raising a stink. Some local groups are worried about the impact on the riparian zone along Whisper Creek itself. They say the initial environmental impact assessment was rushed incomplete. Plus, there are rumors about the land acquisition. Some small property owners were strong-armed into selling lowballed, threatened with eminent domain, even when it wasn't applicable. This was it. The rot Michael, in his greed and haste, was cutting corners, not just financially, but ethically and legally. Show me the permits, Frank, the zoning requests, everything you could. Get your hands on regarding Whisper Creek. Frank had managed to get copies of several public documents, plat maps, initial environmental studies, preliminary building permits. He even had a copy of the original land survey, from when I had considered developing that area myself decades ago and rejected it due to the inherent challenges. I spread the documents across the table, poring over them with the intensity of a surgeon. My fingers calloused from a lifetime of labor. Now trace lines on paper, seeking vulnerabilities. My eyes, once scanning blueprints for structural integrity, now search for cracks in their scheme. The original survey, my own notes from 25 years ago, highlighted a significant seasonal wetland that fed into Whisper Creek. It was a crucial part of the local ecosystem, a natural buffer against flooding. Developing it would require extensive, costly mitigation efforts, or a complete rerouting of water, which would be even more expensive and ecologically damaging. It was why I had abandoned the idea back then. Michael's current plans, however, showed residential plots going right into or dangerously close to that wetland zone. His environmental impact assessment was laughably thin, glossing over the wetland entirely, or misclassifying it. He'd clearly bribed or pressured someone in the county planning department to push it through Hess building on a wetland. Frank, I stated the words cold and precise. Or at least he's destroying the natural drainage and floodplain. Has misidentified the land or deliberately omitted crucial hydrological data. It's a federal violation, not just County Clean Water Act, not to mention the state environmental regulations. Frank whistled. That's a hell of a risk, John. Why would he do that? Money, I scoffed. Mitigation is expensive. Rerouting water is even more so. He wants to maximize sellable lots. He thinks he can get away with it because he's Miller Construction, because he thinks he's untouchable. He wasn't. My plan began to form, clear and sharp. I couldn't expose myself. I had to be a ghost. A whisper in the wind I would use. Michael's own arrogance against him. Frank, I said, looking up from the maps, my eyes gleaming with a newfound purpose. I need that burner phone, and I need a way to send an anonymous email. A public library, a coffee shop, somewhere with open Wi-Fi. Over the next few days, I crafted my anonymous message. It wasn't a rambling complaint. It was a highly specific, technically accurate exposé. I referenced federal code sections, specific survey markers, hydrological data, and the glaring omissions in Miller Construction's official environmental impact statement for Whisper Creek. I included excerpts from my own old survey notes, anonymously showing what should have been done. I detailed the potential for severe flooding, ecological damage and structural instability for the future homeowners. I sent it to every relevant agency. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, the Denton County Planning and Zoning Board, and most importantly, to the environmental reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and a couple of local Denton County newspapers. I created a throwaway email account, bouncing it through multiple servers, covering my tracks like a seasoned operative. Then we waited. The silence was deafening for a few days. I busied myself with survival tasks, but my mind was constantly alert. Listening, watching, Frank made another trip to town, bringing back more supplies and, crucially, more newspapers. "It's starting." John, he said, his voice hushed excitement mixed with trepidation. He pointed to a small article on page 3 of the Denton County Chronicle, local environmental groups raise concerns over Whisper Creek development. It was vague, but it mentioned anonymous tips and potential zoning irregularities. 2 days later, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram ran a larger piece. Though still not front-page Miller Constructions, Whisper Creek project under scrutiny for environmental concerns. The article cited multiple sources and an unusually detailed anonymous dossier outlining potential violations of wetlands protection. It mentioned the EPA and TCEQ were reviewing the matter. A cold, grim satisfaction settled in my chest. Michael and Sarah wouldn't suspect me. They'd think it was disgruntled environmentalists, or perhaps a rival developer trying to stir up trouble. They'd dismiss it as a nuisance, a hurdle for Sarah's PR team to smooth over. But I knew better. This was a crack in their foundation. Frank brought more news. Michael's fuming. John, I heard through an old crew member still working there that he's been yelling at his project managers, demanding they find out who's leaking information. Sarah's been working overtime, calling editors, trying to kill the stories. She even put out a press release talking about Miller Constructions' unwavering commitment to sustainable development. Lies. I smiled a thin, humorless line. Good. Let them squirm, let them waste resources. This is just the beginning. But the initial impact, while satisfying, wasn't enough to bring down the whole structure. Michael and Sarah would weather the storm, pay off a few fines, maybe make some token concessions. I needed to hit them harder, where it truly hurt their wallets and their reputation with the powerful players. Frank, I said, pointing to the financial statements again, look at these loans. Look at the terms. Michael's leveraged himself to the hilt. And these names. Orion Holdings. You said they were from Houston. Unsavory types. Frank nodded his brow, furrowed. Yeah, I asked around a bit more. Orion Holdings isn't your typical institutional investor. John, their private equity. But they operate aggressively. Known for taking over distressed assets or investing heavily in projects with high-risk, high-reward profiles, especially in real estate. They don't mind getting their hands dirty. And I heard they've got some serious connections, politically. And otherwise, my mind raced. Michael wasn't just cutting corners. He was playing with fire, getting into bed, with people far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. Orion Holdings likely saw Miller Construction as a juicy target ripe for exploitation. Michael, blinded by his own ambition, was probably a puppet dancing to their tune. Orion Holdings, I repeated the name, tasting like ash in my mouth. They're not just investors, Frank. They're the real power behind Michael. Now, he probably sold them a piece of the company or gave them significant control over Whisper Creek to get that capital. If I can expose their involvement, their methods, the shady dealings, I can not only bring down Whisper Creek, but I can expose Michael's complicity with a much more dangerous entity, and that will hurt him far more than a few environmental fines. Frank looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. John, this isn't just about wetlands anymore. These guys, they play rough. They don't take kindly to people poking their noses where they don't belong. Good, I said, my voice heartening, echoing the steel in my gaze. Neither do I. I need to know everything about Orion Holdings. Frank, every director, every shell company, every major investment. I want their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. Find me their Achilles heel. I looked at the map again, then at the photo of Helen tucked into my worn wallet. Her eyes, so full of love and warmth, now seemed to urge me on, to push me further. This wasn't just about getting my company back, or even about vengeance. This was about dismantling a criminal enterprise that had taken root in my legacy, poisoning everything I had built and threatening to engulf my children, even if they were willing participants. The stakes had just been raised. I was no longer just targeting Michael and Sarah. I was going after the shadowy forces that empowered them, and I knew with a chilling certainty that this next step would be far more dangerous. The ghost had made its presence known. Now it was time to unleash the storm. The cabin became my forge, the solitude my crucible. Each day the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs, a stark contrast to the cloying disinfectant of my recent prison. I worked my body hauling wood, splitting logs, feeling the ache in my muscles, the return of strength to my bones. It was a pilgrimage back to myself, shedding the old man they'd tried to make me, embracing the fighter. Helen had always known Frank's visits were my lifeline to the outside world. Had arrived in his dusty pickup, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, laden with more canned goods, fresh water, and most importantly, information. Each newspaper, each printed financial report he brought was a piece of the puzzle. A shard of their empire. I was learning to dismantle Orion Holdings. I repeated the name, a cold knot in my gut, as I spread out the documents Frank had acquired. Head leaned heavily on his old network of contacts, retired foremen, former suppliers, even a few investigative journalists he'd known from past company crises. What else have you got on them? Frank pulled a chair up to the rickety table, the springs groaning under his weight. They're a ghost. John hard to pin down, based out of Houston, but their money moves like smoke. What I could find, they specialize in distressed assets. Companies in trouble, ripe for takeover. They swoop in, pump in cash, promise salvation, then strip the company bare. They leave behind a shell, sometimes a pile of debt, and vanish. He handed me a printout of an obscure article from a San Antonio business journal, dating back 5 years. It detailed the controversial acquisition of a regional trucking company that soon after Orion's involvement collapsed under a mountain of debt, leaving hundreds of employees jobless and its pension fund mysteriously empty. The article hinted at aggressive tactics, legal loopholes, and a trail that went cold at a labyrinth of offshore accounts. "They're vultures, John Frank," said, his voice grim. "But it's worse than that. My old friend Carlos, he's still got eyes and ears in the city's concrete game. He heard Michael wasn't just dealing with Orion. He sold them a significant stake in Miller Construction. Not just Whisper Creek, but the whole damn company. Said Michael got desperate when the Whisper Creek scandal broke, needed more capital to cover the fallout. Orion swooped in and offered a bailout, but demanded a piece of the pie. A big one. The news hit me like a physical blow. Michael hadn't just leveraged the company. He'd sold it off piece by piece to predators. My legacy, my life's work, wasn't just being mismanaged. It was being dissected on an operating table with Michael, wielding the scalpel guided by Orion's unseen hand. The rage that surged through me was cold, not hot. It was the calculated fury of a general planning a siege. They're not just investors. Frank, I stated, my voice low and steady. They're the new owners. Michael and Sarah are just puppets, or worse, willing accomplices, fronting for Orion while they bleed. Miller Construction, dry. This isn't just about my company anymore. This is about a criminal enterprise using my name, my reputation to conduct their dirty business. Frank nodded, his face etched with worry. That's what Carlos said. He also heard Michael and Sarah are under immense pressure. Orion's not happy about the Whisper Creek delays. They're losing money. And apparently, they don't take kindly to that. He pulled out another file. This is interesting. There's a massive public-private partnership bid coming up in Dallas. A huge infrastructure project, the new Trinity River Gateway development. Miller Construction is the lead on a consortium bidding for the main bridge and highway expansion. It's worth hundreds of millions. My eyes narrowed. Trinity River Gateway. I remember that proposal. It's a landmark project. A feather in the cap for whoever gets it. And if Orion is pulling the strings, they'll want it. Big time, exactly, Frank said. And Michael is pushing it hard. He's been meeting with city council members, state reps, even some federal guys. All very hush-hush. Carlos said it's Miller Construction's biggest play in a decade. If they get it, it'll make up for any Whisper Creek losses tenfold. This was it. Not just a crack, but the main support column. If I could expose Orion's true nature, their control over Miller, construction, and any potential corruption in this bid, I could bring down not just Michael and Sarah, but the shadowy operators behind them. The Trinity River Gateway was Orion's golden goose, using Miller Constructions, a long-standing, once unblemished reputation as a Trojan horse. Frank, I said, a dangerous glint in my eye. I need every single detail about that Trinity River Gateway bid. The technical specifications, the financials, the timeline, the other bidders. Everything I need to know how they plan to win it, and I need to find the lie. Over the next few weeks, the cabin became my war room. Frank, bless his loyal heart, became my intelligence operative. He navigated the murky waters of public records, called in every favor, leaned on every old connection. He brought me blueprints, bid proposals, environmental impact statements for the Trinity River Gateway. Even internal Miller Construction memos he'd gotten from a sympathetic, soon-to-be-retired administrative assistant. I devoured the information in my mind, a steel trap sifting through layers of technical jargon, financial projections, and legal clauses. It was like building a skyscraper, in reverse, deconstructing it piece by piece, looking for the stress points, the hidden weaknesses. I knew, construction knew, how bids were won and lost. I knew the subtle art of cutting corners without getting caught, and I knew how to find those corners when someone else cut them. The Trinity River Gateway project was immense complex. It involved a new bridge, several miles of highway, extensive flood control measures, and significant environmental mitigation in the rivers. Delicate ecosystem. Michael's bid, under Orion's watchful eye, was aggressive, almost too good to be true. And that I knew was where the rot lay. My eyes scanned the material, specs, the projected timelines, the subcontractor lists. Then I saw it. A glaring discrepancy in the concrete mix for the bridge pilings. They were specifying a lower grade, faster setting concrete than required for a structure of that scale and environmental exposure. It would save millions up front, accelerate the construction timeline, making their bid more attractive. But it would compromise the structural integrity, leading to premature deterioration, cracking, and potential catastrophic failure down the line. It was a ticking time bomb. This wasn't just cutting corners. This was criminal negligence. It wasn't just about money. It was about endangering lives. Orion was willing to sacrifice public safety for profit, and Michael was their willing tool. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was about protecting the city I helped build, protecting innocent people who would drive on that bridge. They're planning to use substandard materials for the bridge pilings. Frank, I whispered, pointing to the specific section of the spec sheet. Lower grade concrete. It'll fail, maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not in 5 years, but it will fail. And when it does, it'll be a disaster. Frank stared at the document, his face ashen. My God, John, that sounds unthinkable. Unthinkable to us. I countered my voice sharp with disgust. But to Orion, it's just another cost-saving measure. And Michael is either too blind or too greedy to care. The plan solidified I needed to expose this, not just to the environmental agencies, but to the Federal Highway Administration, to the Dallas City Council, to the public. It had to be undeniable, irrefutable. Using the burner phone and the anonymous email accounts Frank had helped set up, I began to craft a new dossier. This one was even more meticulously detailed than the Whisper Creek one I cited, federal engineering standards, specific material codes, the precise structural calculations. I compared their proposed concrete mix to the required standards. Highlighting the catastrophic implications, I included excerpts from Miller Construction's own internal reports, the ones I had access to from my time running the company, that explicitly warned against such shortcuts. This wasn't just a leak. It was a demolition. I sent it to every relevant federal and state agency, to every major news outlet in Texas, to influential engineering associations, and to key city council members known for their integrity. I made sure to include a specific call for an independent third-party, metallurgical and structural review of Miller Construction's bid. The response was immediate and explosive. Unlike the slow burn of Whisper Creek, the Trinity River Gateway scandal hit like a lightning bolt. Front-page headlines screamed, Miller Construction's multi-million-dollar bridge, bid under federal scrutiny for material safety concerns. Anonymous sources allege substandard concrete in Trinity River. Gateway proposal. The political fallout was immense. The Dallas City Council immediately put the bid on hold. The Federal Highway Administration launched a full investigation. The TCEQ, already looking into Whisper Creek, joined forces with the EPA to review Miller Construction's environmental track record. Suddenly, my children's meticulously constructed house of cards began to sway violently. Frank arrived at the cabin a few days later, breathless. John, it's chaos. Michael's been called before the council. Sarah's PR firm is working triple overtime, but they can't spin this. Orion Holdings is furious. They're demanding answers, threatening to pull their funding to call in loans. They're blaming Michael and Sarah for the leaks, for the incompetence. I felt a grim satisfaction. This was the war I had envisioned, watching them turn on each other, watching their empire crumble from within. But then Frank's face clouded. John, I think they're looking for you, or for whoever is doing this. What do you mean? I asked, a sudden chill running down my spine. Carlos, he got a call. Not from Michael, but from a private investigator. Michael hired a tough-looking guy, ex-military. He was asking about disgruntled former employees, asking specifically about anyone with deep knowledge of Miller Construction's operations, anyone who might have a grudge against Michael. He even mentioned your name, John, saying you were missing from the assisted living facility. They're putting 2 and 2 together. My heart pounded. They were closing in. My ghost status was at risk. And it's not just Michael's. P.I. Frank continued his voice, barely a whisper. I heard from another source, someone connected to Orion Holdings. They've brought in their own muscle. People who don't ask questions, just find answers, and they don't play by the rules. John, these guys, they make the mob look like choir boys. That night I didn't sleep. I paced the cabin. the old floorboard creaking underfoot. The silence of the woods, once a comfort, now felt like a prelude to danger. I was no longer a phantom unseen and unheard. I was a target. The next morning, Frank arrived earlier than usual, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He held a small plastic bag, clear and Ziploc sealed. Inside was a piece of paper folded precisely. "I found this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "On the porch, tucked under a loose floorboard. It wasn't there when I left last night." My hands shook as I took the bag. I unfolded the paper. It was a photograph. An old photograph. One I hadn't seen in years. It was of me. Helen, Michael, and Sarah taken decades ago on a family picnic by the Brazos River. We were all smiling carefree, but this photo was different. Someone had meticulously cut out my face, leaving a jagged, empty hole where I once was. And on the back, scrawled in thick black marker, were two words that sent a jolt of ice through my veins, chilling me to the bone. "We see you." The photograph, with my face savagely cut out, mocked me. "We see you." The words were a brand searing themselves into my mind. The air in the cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. They weren't just searching anymore. They were sending a message. They knew I was alive. And if Orion Holdings was involved, that message wasn't a warning. It was a promise. A death threat. Frank's face was ashen. "We have to go." "John, now they found this. They'll find us." My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, pure adrenaline. They had underestimated me once. They wouldn't get a second chance. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within, but we're not running further into the woods, Frank. "We're going to them." Frank stared at me, his eyes wide. "What, John, you're not thinking straight?" "They'll kill you." "They'll try," I agreed, a grim smile touching my lips. "But they won't succeed. I've given them enough time to make their move. Now it's my turn." We packed quickly, leaving behind nothing that could identify the cabin as a safe house. Frank, loyal to the core, followed my lead, though I could see the fear etched on his face. We drove through the night, not west, but east, towards the gleaming, indifferent lights of Dallas, Fort Worth. My plan was simple in its audacity. I couldn't fight Orion's muscle directly, but I could hit them where it hurt most, their carefully constructed web of lies, and influence the Trinity River Gateway project. It was their biggest play, the linchpin of their control over Miller Construction, the ultimate symbol of Michael's ambition and greed. If I could expose the concrete fraud there publicly and undeniably, it would bring down not just Michael and Sarah, but severely cripple Orion Holdings. I spent the next few days in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Fort Worth, a ghost in plain sight. Frank, using a different burner phone, continued to gather intelligence carefully, avoiding any direct contact with Miller Construction or Orion. He confirmed that the federal investigation into the Trinity River Gateway bid was escalating. Spurred by my anonymous tips, the Dallas City Council was increasingly nervous, facing public pressure. Orion Holdings, through Michael, was pushing hard to get the bid approved before the scrutiny became insurmountable. "They've set a date." John Frank reported, his voice low over the phone. "The City Council is holding a special session next Tuesday. It's a make-or-break vote for the Trinity River Gateway. Michael's going to be there. Sarah, too. They're planning a massive presentation, a charm offensive to push it through." This was it, the public arena. The stage for the final act. I had one more ace up my sleeve. A piece of evidence so damning, so irrefutable that it would shatter their facade beyond repair. When I was CEO, I'd had an independent engineering report commissioned for a prototype concrete mix. We were developing one that had specific weaknesses related to the very substandard materials Michael was now proposing for the Trinity River Gateway. The report, buried deep in my personal archives, explicitly detailed the dangers and why it was unsuitable for major infrastructure. I had kept a digital copy encrypted and backed up a habit from my early days of protecting intellectual property. It was the only secret I hadn't lost when they stripped me bare. Frank, with careful instructions, had retrieved it from a secure cloud storage I'd set up years ago using an old recovery key I'd entrusted to him for emergencies. Now I crafted my final anonymous message. This wasn't just a leak. It was a detonation. I compiled my previous expose of the Trinity River Gateway fraud, adding the irrefutable evidence from my old engineering report. I highlighted the precise sections detailing the inferior concrete, the projected failure points, the catastrophic risk to public safety. I also included what Frank had uncovered about Orion Holdings, their history of asset stripping, their aggressive tactics, and their suspected criminal ties, drawing a clear line between their involvement and Michael's fraudulent bid. But I didn't send it to the media directly. Not yet. I sent it to a highly respected independent engineering ethics committee, to a few key federal prosecutors known for their tenacity, and crucially to a local Dallas City Council member I knew to be incorruptible. A man named Henderson, whom I had personally vouched for in his first campaign. I gave them a deadline before the special council meeting on Tuesday. I knew Henderson would act Monday night. Frank and I met in a desolate parking lot behind a shuttered diner. He looked even more gaunted, his eyes darting nervously. "John, there are people asking questions about me now. Orion's people. They know I helped you. I saw a black SUV following me today. Then you need to disappear. Frank," I said, handing him a thick envelope of cash. "Go to your sisters in Arizona. Don't come back until I tell you it's safe. And don't answer any calls from numbers you don't recognize." He hesitated, looking at me with a mixture of fear and admiration. "What about you, John? What are you going to do?" I looked at the Fort Worth skyline glittering in the distance. "A monument to my lost life. I'm going to watch the show, Frank, and then I'm going to finish what I started." He nodded, a silent understanding passing between us. "Be careful, John. You're a good man, not any more, Frank," I replied, the words tasting like ash. "Not any more." He drove away, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. I was alone, a ghost. Tuesday arrived crisp and clear. The air crackled with anticipation. Or perhaps it was just my nerves. I dressed in a nondescript suit I'd bought with cash, a cheap pair of glasses to alter my appearance, and a baseball cap pulled low. I was Big John Miller, but not as anyone would recognize me. The special Dallas City Council meeting was held in the cavernous council chambers, packed with reporters, concerned citizens, and the usual array of lobbyists and developers. I slipped in, finding a seat in the back, obscured by a large support pillar. Michael and Sarah were there, front and center. Michael impeccably dressed, exuding a false confidence. A forced smile plastered on his face. Sarah beside him was a picture of poised professionalism, her usual charming facade firmly in place. They truly believed they could spin their way out of this. Representatives from Orion Holdings, a few grim-faced men in dark suits, sat a few rows behind them, observing with predatory intensity. The meeting began with the usual procedural fanfare. Then Michael stepped up to the podium, launching into his presentation, a slick, polished performance full of buzzwords about innovation, economic growth, and community partnership. He dismissed the unfounded rumors about Whisper Creek and the misinformation regarding the Trinity River Gateway as the work of disgruntled competitors and sensationalist media. Sarah nodded approvingly, occasionally, whispering something to him. I watched my jaw tight. They were so arrogant, so convinced of their own invincibility. Then, halfway through Michael's presentation, City Councilman Henderson, a man whose integrity I trusted, raised his hand. His face was grim. Mr. Miller, Henderson began his voice, cutting through Michael's practiced cadence. I have some grave concerns that have been brought to my attention. Concerns, I might add, that are corroborated by highly credible independent sources and backed by irrefutable technical data. Michael's confident smile faltered. Councilman, I assure you our bid is sound. These are allegations of criminal negligence. Mr. Miller, Henderson interrupted his voice, rising and potential fraud on a scale that could endanger thousands of lives. He held up a thick dossier. I have here an independent engineering report dating back to 1998, commissioned by your father, John Miller, which explicitly warns against the use of the very concrete mix you are proposing for the bridge pilings of the Trinity River Gateway. It details the precise structural weaknesses and the high probability of catastrophic failure under environmental stress. A gasp rippled through the chamber. Michael's face went white. Sarah's eyes, usually so calculating, now held a flash of genuine panic. The Orion men shifted their grim expressions, hardening into something murderous. Furthermore, Henderson continued, now addressing the entire council. This council has also received extensive documentation regarding the undisclosed involvement of Orion Holdings in Miller Construction, a company with a documented history of asset stripping and questionable business practices. And concerning your Whisper Creek development, Mr. Miller, the EPA and TCEQ have just issued a preliminary injunction, halting all construction, citing evidence of deliberate wetland destruction and significant violations of environmental law. The chamber erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. Microphones were shoved into faces. Michael was visibly shaking his carefully constructed composure, shattering Sarah, ever the public face, tried to regain control. Stepping forward, her voice shrill. This is outrageous. Slander. We deny these baseless accusations. But it was too late. The dam had broken. As the chaos unfolded, a man in a dark suit, clearly an Orion operative, discreetly approached Michael, his face a mask of cold fury. He whispered something, his words unheard amidst the din, but his meaning unmistakable. He grabbed Michael's arm, his grip tight, pulling him away from the podium. Michael looked terrified, not just by the council, but by the man pulling him. Just then, a team of federal agents, led by a stern-faced FBI agent, entered the chamber. They moved directly towards Michael and Sarah. Michael Miller, Sarah Miller. The agent announced, his voice booming over the noise. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, endangerment of public safety, and multiple federal environmental violations. You have the right to remain silent. Michael stared, his mouth agape, as the handcuffs clicked into place. Sarah, her face contorted in a silent scream of disbelief, was cuffed next. She tried to protest, her words choked by tears, but it was useless. As they were led away, their eyes for a fleeting moment met mine in the back of the room. There was no recognition, only a raw, primal hatred born of total ruin. They saw only a ghost, an anonymous figure watching their downfall. They would never know it was their father. The Orion men, seeing the federal agents quickly and quietly, melted away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Michael and Sarah to face the music, alone. Their puppet show was over. I watched them being led out, the cheers and shouts of the crowd, fading into a dull roar in my ears. The revenge was complete. Their empire was destroyed. Their reputations, their freedom, their future, all shattered. Miller. Construction, the company I built, would be dissolved, its name forever tarnished by their greed and Orion's corruption. I slipped out of the chambers quietly as I had entered, blending into the stunned, jubilant crowd. The Texas sun was bright, but it felt cold on my skin. I walked for hours aimlessly through the streets of Dallas, the city I had helped to build. The high-rises I'd erected, the foundations I'd poured, they seemed to mock me, monuments to a life that was irrevocably gone. I had sought justice, I had sought vengeance, and I had found it. But the victory felt hollow. A bitter ash in my mouth. They were gone, ruined. But what was left of me? The ghost of John Miller. That's what I returned to the motel that night, staring at my reflection. In the dim mirror, the man looking back wasn't Big John. His eyes held a sadness that ran deeper than any betrayal, a weariness that went beyond the physical. He was a survivor. Yes, a relentless force that had brought down an empire, but he was also a stranger to himself. My home was gone. My company was gone. My children were gone. Not just to prison, but lost to me, forever consumed by their own darkness. My legacy was a wreckage I had built, and then I had destroyed. I had won the war, but I had lost everything in the process. My heart, once filled with the warmth of family, was now an empty cavern, echoing with the ghosts of what might have been. The man who walked out of that assisted living facility had died, replaced by an instrument of retribution. And now that the task was done, there was nothing left but the silence. The chilling, profound silence of absolute victory, absolute loss. I took off the cap, the glasses. I looked at my reflection, a face etched with the cost of my journey. This was me now, the ghost, the end.